Snow fell over Manhattan in thick, silent sheets on the morning everything changed, blanketing the glass tower of Ashcroft Dynamics until the building looked like something carved from ice rather than built by hands. Inside, on the 12th floor, a man in a faded gray maintenance jacket knelt beside an open electrical panel, his tools spread across a canvas mat with the kind of order that suggested discipline rather than habit. Nobody glanced twice at him. Employees hurried past with coffee cups and tablets, murmuring about quarterly numbers and board meetings. The man at the wall nothing more to them than a fixture of the building, as forgettable as the carpet or the potted plants near the elevators. He worked without hurry, his hands steady, his eyes moving across wires and circuits with a precision that belonged to a different kind of life entirely. Then the doors of the private elevator opened, and a woman with silver hair and a wool coat, the color of ash, stepped into the lobby, a driver trailing behind her with a briefcase. She was reaching for her coffee when her gaze drifted toward the wall, toward the kneeling man in the gray jacket, and something in her chest seized so suddenly that the cup slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. The sound cracked through the lobby like a gunshot, and every head turned. But the woman did not look down at the mess. She stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth, staring at a face she had spent 12 years believing was buried in a grave with a folded flag on top of it. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. Yet it carried through the marble hall, as though the building itself had gone silent to hear it. She said the words slowly, disbelief and grief and something like joy all tangled together in her throat, insisting that it could not be possible, that the man they called Orion had died 12 years earlier, in a place none of them were ever allowed to name. The maintenance workers near the panel exchanged confused glances. A security guard reached instinctively for his radio, but the man on his knees only set down his wrench, wiped his palm against his trousers, and looked up at her with the faint, tired smile of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment 1,000 times in his sleep, and never quite believed he would live to see it happen. He told her, in a voice as calm as still water, that he had once believed the very same thing about himself. Silas Mercer had not always been invisible. There had been a version of him once who moved through embassies and mountain passes and blacked out convoys with a name that made generals sit up straighter in their chairs, a version of him whose face existed in exactly 4 photographs across the entire federal government, each one locked behind clearance most people would never know existed. But that version of him had been gone a long time, folded away like a uniform nobody wears anymore, and the man who now spent his mornings in the maintenance corridors of Ashcroft Dynamics preferred it that way. He arrived each day in the same gray jacket, boots scuffed from years of use, a canvas bag of tools slung over one shoulder, and he spoke to almost no one beyond what the job required. His apartment 3 trains away held little more than a bed, a chair, a shelf of paperback novels, and a single framed photograph of a woman whose smile had once been the only thing that made his silence bearable. She had been gone many years now, and in the quiet that followed her passing, Silas had built a life so small and so plain that nobody looking at him would ever suspect it had once contained continents and classified missions and a code name that intelligence officers still whispered about in training rooms they thought were secure. He had taken the contract at Ashcroft Dynamics because it asked nothing of him beyond competence. And competence was something he still possessed in abundance, even after all the years of hiding it. The pay was modest, the hours were long, the building's junior staff treated him the way people often treat anyone in a uniform that isn't tailored, with a kind of polite blindness that Silas had come to find almost restful, because nobody who ignores you ever asks you difficult questions. One afternoon, a floor manager named Gregory Hale, a young man with a stiff collar and an even stiffer sense of his own importance, had told Silas rather sharply that maintenance staff were expected to use the service entrance at the rear of the building rather than the main lobby doors, and Silas had simply nodded and complied without a flicker of protest, because arguing was the kind of thing that drew attention, and attention was the one thing he had spent 12 years avoiding. Across the lobby that same week, Vivian Ashcroft, the company's chief executive, had noticed the exchange from a distance while crossing toward her private elevator. She had paused for half a second, her brow furrowing slightly at the coldness in Gregory's tone. But she had said nothing and moved on. assuming, as anyone in her position might, that the man in the gray jacket was simply one more face among the hundreds who kept the building running and required no particular thought. What none of them knew, not Gregory, not Vivienne, not the dozens of employees who walked past that panel every single day, was that 3 nights earlier a fault in the aging wiring behind that very wall had begun smoldering quietly inside the insulation, a slow and hidden thing that would have, within another week, sparked a fire capable of gutting an entire floor of sensitive research data. Silas had found it not because anyone asked him to look, but because his eyes had never fully unlearned the habit of noticing what other people missed. He rerouted the circuit himself, quietly, without filing the kind of report that might have brought engineers and executives down to ask questions he had no interest in answering. By the time he closed the panel and gathered his tools that morning, the danger was gone, and no one in the building would ever know how close they had come to catastrophe or how effortlessly the man they overlooked had prevented it. It was in that exact moment, as he wiped grease from his hands and rose to his feet, that the elevator doors opened and Eleanor Ashcroft walked into the lobby and dropped her coffee cup on the marble floor. Eleanor had not expected to feel anything that morning beyond the mild irritation of an early board call and the ache in her knees from the cold. She was 64 years old, retired now from the daily operations of the company she had co-founded 3 decades earlier, though she still kept an office on the top floor and still appeared several mornings a week out of habit more than necessity. She had lived a life that few of her employees fully understood, one that stretched back to years spent advising federal agencies on matters she was contractually forbidden from discussing even at dinner parties among old friends. She had seen things in those years that still visited her in dreams, and among all of them, one figure stood taller and stranger than the rest. A man whose real name she had learned only once, whispered to her in a debriefing room by an official who made her swear never to repeat it. That name was Silas Mercer. The code name attached to him in mission files, spoken only by those with the highest clearance in the room, was Orion. Standing now in the lobby with shattered porcelain at her feet, Eleanor felt the past 2 decades collapse into a single instant, memories rushing forward with a force that made her knees weak. She remembered a night in a country she was never permitted to name, remembered gunfire and smoke and a hand closing around her wrist and pulling her through a doorway seconds before it collapsed. She remembered waking in a safe house with her ribs bandaged and being told that the man who had carried her 3 miles through hostile terrain had a code name and nothing else, no rank she could search, no unit she could ask about, nothing but 4 letters that meant everything to the handful of people cleared to know them. She remembered, years later, sitting in a private briefing where a solemn official informed her that Orion had been lost during an extraction gone wrong, his body never recovered, his name quietly added to a memorial wall that existed in a building most Americans didn't know existed. She had grieved him the way one grieves a stranger who saved your life and then vanished from it entirely, with a hollow, private ache she carried for 12 years and never spoke of to another living soul. And now he was standing in her company's lobby, in a maintenance jacket, tools in hand, looking at her as though he, too, had been waiting for this exact reckoning. She called out his code name first, instinct overriding everything else, her voice cracking on the single syllable in a way that made the security guard near the desk take a half-step forward in confusion. Silas did not answer. He only looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. And then, with the same unhurried calm he brought to every task, he bent down, picked up the wrench he had set aside, and tightened the final bolt on the panel he had just finished repairing, as though the woman standing 10 feet away hadn't just called out a name that belonged to a ghost. It was only when Eleanor took 2 unsteady steps toward him, her voice dropping into something quieter and far more certain, that he finally stopped. She said his real name that time, the one almost nobody alive still knew, the one that existed on a single classified document she herself had signed years ago. And at the sound of it, something in Silas's posture shifted, some old wall lowering by an inch, because there were only ever 2 people who had known both names, and one of them had died along with the rest of his old life. Vivienne arrived at the scene only moments later, drawn by the sound of shattering porcelain, and the strange hush that had fallen over the lobby. She found her mother standing pale and trembling before a maintenance worker, of all people, and her first instinct was concern, quickly followed by confusion when she registered the words her mother kept repeating under her breath. Vivienne had grown up hearing fragments of her mother's old life, vague references to work Eleanor had done for the government before Ashcroft Dynamics existed, stories that were always cut short before they reached anything resembling a real answer. She had never once heard the name Orion before that morning, and watching her mother's hands shake as she reached out toward a stranger in a work jacket, Vivienne felt a very reasonable, very corporate instinct rise in her chest, the instinct that told her this was almost certainly some strange coincidence, a case of grief and memory playing tricks on a woman who had spent decades carrying secrets too heavy for anyone to hold indefinitely. She stepped forward gently, taking her mother's elbow, murmuring that they should sit down, that whoever this man was, they could sort it out somewhere quieter than a lobby full of watching employees. But Eleanor would not be moved so easily. She turned to her daughter with an intensity Vivienne had rarely seen in her, insisting that this was not confusion, not grief, not some trick of an aging mind, and that the man standing before them had once carried her through fire when she was younger than Vivienne was now. She spoke of the night in question only in fragments, careful even now, decades later, not to say more than her old clearance still technically allowed, but the fragments were enough to plant a small, uncomfortable seed of doubt in Vivienne's otherwise rational mind. Still, doubt was not proof. And proof was something Vivienne had built her entire professional life around demanding before she believed anything. She looked at Silas properly for the first time then, taking in the plain jacket, the calloused hands, the quiet stillness of a man who had said almost nothing since her mother's outburst began, and she found it difficult to reconcile the ordinary figure before her with whatever legend her mother seemed to be describing. She told her mother, as kindly as she could manage in front of an audience of curious employees, that they would look into it properly, quietly, and without causing a scene that would end up as gossip in every department by lunchtime. Eleanor did not argue further, though her eyes never left Silas's face, and as security ushered the small group toward a private conference room, she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small leather wallet she had carried, unopened, for longer than either of her children had been alive, and inside it, worn soft at the edges from years of handling, was a single photograph. The photograph, when Eleanor finally laid it on the conference table, showed a much younger man standing in half shadow, his face turned slightly away from the camera, as though he had sensed the shutter click a fraction of a second, too late to fully avoid it. Even in profile, even blurred by age and poor lighting, the resemblance to the man now sitting quietly across the table was impossible to dismiss entirely. Vivienne studied the image for a long moment, her analytical mind cycling through every rational explanation available to her. Coincidence, family resemblance, some trick of memory her mother's grief had constructed without meaning to. She asked Silas directly whether he recognized the man in the photograph, and for the first time since the encounter began, something flickered across his expression that might have been the ghost of an old sorrow. He told her, quietly, that the man in the photograph had died the same year the picture was taken. In every sense that mattered to the people who were supposed to depend on him staying alive. He did not elaborate immediately, and Vivienne, sensing that pressing too hard too fast would gain her nothing, allowed the silence to stretch instead of filling it. It was Eleanor who finally spoke again, her voice steadier now, carrying the practiced authority of a woman who had once briefed cabinet officials without flinching. She explained, in careful, measured language that revealed only what she believed she was still permitted to reveal, that the man once known by the code name Orion had operated for years in a division so classified that even people within the intelligence community rarely knew it existed. His specialty had been extraction, pulling people out of situations that official channels could not touch. Hostages, defectors, operatives whose exposure would have triggered international incidents. He had done this work without recognition, without a public record, without so much as a commendation ceremony, because the entire premise of his existence required that officially he did not exist at all. Eleanor described a final mission gone catastrophically wrong. One she had only ever heard about secondhand, through channels that no longer existed. A mission after which the man called Orion was declared dead, his body unrecovered, his file quietly sealed and archived in a records room few people were ever cleared to enter. What Eleanor did not know, and what Silas finally admitted in that conference room, with the kind of exhausted honesty that only comes after carrying something alone for far too long, was that his death had never actually happened. The mission had gone wrong. Yes, catastrophically so. And in the chaos of its collapse, he had made a decision that no official report would ever record, a decision to let the world believe he had died. Rather than return to a life that had already cost him nearly everything he cared about. He explained, haltingly at first, and then with more clarity, that the work had begun consuming pieces of him long before that final mission, that each extraction, each vanished identity, each year spent unable to tell even his own wife the true shape of his days, and had worn something down inside him that he no longer knew how to repair. When the opportunity arose amid the wreckage of that last operation to simply disappear, to let the name Orion die quietly in a file cabinet, instead of continuing to consume the man attached to it, he had taken it without hesitation. He changed his name legally, through channels that required favors he would spend years repaying in silence. He refused every medal that might have been posthumously offered, refused every pension, every benefit, every trace that might one day lead someone back to a man who wanted, more than anything, simply to stop being hunted by his own history. Vivienne listened to all of this, with her arms folded and her expression carefully neutral. And when Silas finished speaking, she told him, not unkindly, that a compelling story was not the same thing as verified fact, and that she intended to have his employment records reviewed before she allowed herself to believe any of it. The review, conducted quietly by Human Resources over the following 2 days, produced almost nothing of interest. Silas Mercer's file was thin, unremarkable, the kind of paperwork trail that belonged to a man who had drifted through a series of maintenance and contracting jobs for the better part of a decade without ever drawing attention to himself. There were no criminal charges, no notable achievements, no advanced degrees or specialized certifications beyond the basic electrical licensing required for his current role. It was, on its surface, the file of an entirely unremarkable man, and for a brief moment, Vivienne allowed herself to believe that her mother's certainty had simply been the product of an old woman's longing for a chapter of her life she had never fully closed. But then the analyst assigned to the review noticed something strange, something that made her sit back from her desk and reread the file twice before flagging it for her supervisor. Every record connected to Silas Mercer, every trace of his existence in any searchable database, began abruptly in the year 2014. Before that date, there was nothing. No school records, no prior employment, no credit history, no documented existence of any kind. As though the man had simply materialized into the world fully grown, with a social security number and a driver's license, and absolutely no history preceding either. That single, glaring absence unsettled Vivienne far more than her mother's emotional outburst in the lobby ever had, because an emotional outburst could be explained away as grief, but a complete and total erasure of a person's history before a specific date could not be explained by sentiment alone. It suggested planning. It suggested resources. It suggested exactly the kind of institutional intervention that only a government agency could arrange for someone it needed to permanently disappear. Vivienne found herself staring at the blank space where a man's entire childhood, education, and early adulthood should have existed. And for the first time since the encounter began, the cool, rational skepticism she had been holding on to started to loosen its grip. She authorized a deeper search, one that required pulling Silas's employment badge information through the company's own security clearance systems, a step that should have taken minutes, and instead triggered something none of the technicians in the security office had ever seen happen before. The moment Silas's badge photograph was run through the building's facial recognition database, the entire system froze for a fraction of a second before flooding the screen with information that made the security technician's hands go still over his keyboard. Rather than returning a simple employee profile, the system pulled up an archived record buried so deep within the company's original security infrastructure that most of the current staff didn't even know it existed. a relic from the earliest days of Ashcroft Dynamics, when the company had done classified contract work for federal agencies decades earlier. Across the screen, in stark block letters, appeared a designation that made the technician's blood run cold. Classified Level Omega, a clearance tier so far above anything currently used in the building that its very existence in the system was, technically speaking, a security violation waiting to be explained. Beneath it, a single line of text confirmed what Eleanor had been saying from the very first moment, a match against an archived biometric profile belonging to an operative whose true identity had been sealed under federal protection protocols. The screen displayed two words that would have meant nothing to most of the staff gathered around the monitor, and everything to the handful who understood what they represented. Clearance accepted. Word of the discovery spread through the security office within minutes, and by the time Vivienne arrived to see the screen for herself, half the technical staff had gathered in a loose, nervous cluster near the monitor, uncertain whether they were witnessing a technical glitch, a security breach, or something far stranger than either. Vivienne stared at the designation for a long moment, feeling something shift inside her chest that she couldn't fully name, some blend of disbelief and vindication for her mother, and a creeping, uncomfortable awareness that the quiet man she had dismissed as an ordinary contractor might in fact be exactly who Eleanor claimed he was. She asked the lead technician, a sharp young woman named Priya Okafor, whether such a clearance level could be faked or spoofed by someone with sufficient technical skill. And Priya, after several minutes of frantic cross-referencing, told her with visible unease that the biometric match wasn't the kind of thing that could be forged, not without resources far beyond anything available outside a federal agency itself. Only one person, the system indicated, had ever possessed the authority to activate this particular protocol, and that person was supposed to have died 12 years earlier in a country that officially no one had ever set foot in. While the security office buzzed with quiet disbelief, Silas remained exactly where he had been left. In the small break room, near the maintenance corridor, drinking black coffee from a paper cup with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything else. He did not seem surprised when Vivienne finally found him there, her expression no longer carrying the polished skepticism she had walked in with earlier that morning. She sat across from him without preamble and told him plainly what the system had revealed, watching his face carefully for any reaction, any flicker of surprise or panic that might suggest deception. There was none. He simply nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had long expected to eventually surface, and told her that systems like that one were designed specifically never to forget, no matter how many years passed or how many names a man tried to bury himself under. Vivienne opened her mouth to ask another question, something sharper about why a maintenance contract at her company had triggered a federal-level security protocol in the first place, but before she could speak, every screen in the break room flickered violently and went black. The attack, when the technical team finally understood its scope, was unlike anything Ashcroft Dynamics had ever faced in its history. Within minutes, security cameras across 4 floors went dark simultaneously, their feeds replaced with a looping static pattern that defeated every attempt to restore them. The corporate firewall, a system the company had spent millions building and rebuilding over the years, began failing in cascading waves, each breach opening a wider gap for whatever was moving through the network. Deep within the research servers, encrypted files containing years of proprietary defense contracting data, information the company had spent a decade developing under strict federal oversight, began quietly copying themselves to external destinations no one in the building could immediately trace. Panic spread through the technical staff with the speed of the breach itself, engineers shouting over one another, executives pouring out of conference rooms demanding answers nobody could yet provide. The entire building sliding rapidly toward a kind of controlled chaos that Vivienne had never witnessed in all her years running the company. It was Silas who moved first, calmly and without asking permission, walking directly into the center of the emergency response room, as though he had done this exact thing 100 times before, which, in a sense, he studied the cascading error messages on the main monitor for only a handful of seconds, his eyes narrowing slightly as patterns emerged from the chaos that the rest of the room was still too panicked to see clearly. Then, in a voice that carried none of the frantic energy filling the room around him, He issued a single instruction, telling the lead engineer to cut all power to the 17th floor immediately. Every circuit, every server, every backup system on that level, and to do it within the next 30 seconds, or lose the research data permanently. The engineer hesitated, glancing toward Vivienne for authorization she had no time to properly consider. And in that hesitation, Silas repeated the instruction with a sharpness that left no room for further debate. Vivienne, trusting an instinct she couldn't fully justify even to herself, nodded once, and the engineer's hands flew across the emergency shutdown controls. The 17th floor went dark within seconds. And almost immediately, the cascading failures across the rest of the building began to slow, then stop entirely, the intrusion cut off at what Silas had apparently recognized as its central access point before anyone else in the room had even identified where the attack was truly originating. Within minutes, the firewall stabilized. The camera feeds flickered back to life, one by one. The exodus of stolen data ground to a halt mid-transfer, leaving behind only fragments of what the intruders had managed to extract before losing their connection. The room, which moments earlier had teetered on the edge of complete disaster, slowly settled into stunned, exhausted silence, and every eye in the space turned toward the man in the gray maintenance jacket who had just done in under a minute what an entire technical department had failed to accomplish in 20. Vivienne stared at him, questions crowding her throat faster than she could organize them into words. But Silas was already turning away from the monitors, his expression unreadable, his focus already shifting toward something the rest of the room hadn't yet considered. He told them, quietly enough that only those closest to him could hear, that what had just happened was not the work of an outside hacker, not some anonymous group operating from a server farm halfway across the world. The precision of the breach, the specific knowledge of which systems to target first, the exact timing that coincided almost perfectly with the moment his own clearance had been flagged in the security database. All of it pointed towards something far more troubling. Someone inside the company, someone with detailed knowledge of its internal infrastructure and its most sensitive research, had either orchestrated the attack directly or provided the access necessary for it to succeed. The silence that followed his words was heavier than the one that had followed the earlier chaos, because chaos, at least, had an external enemy to blame. This was something else entirely. A wound from within, and everyone in that room understood immediately that trust, once broken in this particular way, rarely put itself back together easily. Over the following 2 days, Silas conducted an investigation that unfolded almost entirely outside the awareness of the company's official security staff, moving through server logs and badge access records with the same quiet, methodical patience he had once brought to tracking targets across hostile territory. He said little to anyone during this time, occasionally requesting access to specific files or asking pointed, seemingly unrelated questions of junior staff who had no idea they were being carefully evaluated. Vivienne, watching from a cautious distance, found herself both unsettled and strangely reassured by the transformation taking place in front of her, the quiet maintenance contractor steadily giving way to someone far more precise, far more deliberate, someone whose competence in this particular arena seemed to confirm every claim her mother had made in that first chaotic hour in the lobby. By the second evening, Silas requested a private meeting with Vivienne alone. And when she arrived at the small conference room he had chosen, she found a folder waiting on the table. Thin, but unmistakably damning, the folder contained financial records, encrypted communications recovered from deleted server logs, and a pattern of data access that traced back consistently to a single executive within the company, a man named Curtis Bramwell, who sat on the board's technology committee and had, until that moment, enjoyed Vivienne's complete professional trust. Silas laid out the evidence methodically, explaining how Bramwell had spent nearly 2 years quietly funneling proprietary research to a rival defense contractor overseas, using his legitimate access to cover his tracks and timing his most aggressive data extraction to coincide with moments of internal chaos, moments he could later blame on external threats or system malfunctions. The security flag triggered by Silas's own biometric profile, Silas explained grimly, had likely accelerated Bramwell's timeline, forcing him to attempt his largest and most reckless extraction yet before anyone could investigate the unusual activity closely enough to catch him, Vivienne sat in stunned silence as the picture assembled itself before her. Betrayal wearing the face of someone she had trusted implicitly, someone who had sat across from her in board meetings for years, while quietly dismantling the foundation of everything her family had built. She asked Silas, her voice tight, with barely controlled anger, what he intended to do with the evidence, and he told her simply that the next move needed to happen quickly, before Bramwell realized how close the investigation had already gotten. The confrontation came sooner than either of them expected, and far more violently. Bramwell, alerted somehow to the mounting scrutiny, arrived at the office late that same evening after most of the staff had gone home, moving through the darkened corridors with the frantic energy of a man who understood his carefully constructed life was collapsing around him. He found Vivienne alone in her office, reviewing the files Silas had compiled, and rather than attempting to explain himself or negotiate his way out of the situation, he did something far more desperate, drawing a pistol from beneath his coat and leveling it at the woman who had once trusted him with the company's most sensitive secrets. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the polished confidence Vivienne had always associated with him in boardrooms, cracking instead under the weight of a man who had run out of options and knew it. He told her that she had no idea what she had stumbled into, that the people he had been working with did not tolerate loose ends, and that her curiosity had just cost her far more than she understood. Silas arrived in the doorway less than 10 seconds later. Alerted by a security alert he had quietly configured to flag exactly this kind of after-hours access to Vivienne's floor, and what happened next unfolded with a speed that neither Vivienne nor Bramwell fully registered until it was already over. Silas did not reach for a weapon, did not raise his voice, did not hesitate even slightly despite the gun pointed across the room. In 3 fluid, economical movements that seemed to belong to an entirely different physics than the rest of the world operated under, he closed the distance between the doorway and Bramwell, redirected the weapon's aim away from Vivienne with one hand while the other found the pressure point at Bramwell's wrist that made his fingers open involuntarily and had the man pinned face down against the office floor before the gun had even finished clattering across the carpet. The entire exchange took less than 4 seconds, and by the time security guards arrived, drawn by the commotion, Bramwell was already restrained, and Vivienne was standing exactly where she had been the entire time, unharmed, staring at the man who had just moved through violence, with the same quiet precision he brought to fixing electrical panels. Eleanor arrived shortly afterward, having been called down by a frantic security officer, and she found her daughter sitting shaken but unharmed at her desk, while paramedics attended to Bramwell's restrained form in the hallway outside. When Eleanor's eyes found Silas, standing near the window with his hands still faintly trembling from an adrenaline surge he was too disciplined to show in any other way, something in her expression broke open completely. Decades of grief and gratitude and disbelief finally given somewhere to land. She crossed the room and embraced him without hesitation, tears streaming freely down her face, repeating quietly that it was truly him, that after all these years, after all the nights she had wondered whether she imagined the entire debt she owed a stranger who had once saved her life, he was actually standing here, alive, in her daughter's office, having just done it again. Vivienne watched the exchange from her desk, something shifting permanently in the way she looked at the quiet maintenance contractor she had dismissed only days earlier, her earlier skepticism replaced now by something closer to awe. And beneath that awe, something warmer and more complicated that she wasn't yet ready to name even to herself. The days following Bramwell's arrest passed in a blur of federal interviews, security audits, and quiet reassurances to nervous board members that the breach had been fully contained. Silas cooperated with every investigator who requested his time, answering questions with the same economical honesty he brought to everything else, though he consistently declined the reporters and federal liaisons who wanted to make more of his role in the story than he was willing to allow. On the 3rd morning after the incident, he arrived at Vivienne's office, not in his gray maintenance jacket, but in plain civilian clothes, and he placed a single folded letter on her desk before she could offer him a seat. It was, she realized within the first 2 lines, his resignation, brief and formally worded, thanking the company for the opportunity, and stating simply that his contract responsibilities had concluded and that continued employment no longer suited his circumstances. He did not offer an explanation beyond that. And for a long moment, Vivienne simply stared at the letter, feeling an unexpected and surprisingly sharp reluctance to let him walk back out into the anonymity he had spent 12 years building for himself. She asked him, before he could turn to leave, to sit down for just a few minutes. And something in her tone must have carried enough weight that he complied without argument. She told him plainly that she did not fully understand what had happened over the past week, that a version of reality she had trusted completely only days earlier had been upended by a man in a maintenance jacket, who turned out to be capable of things she still struggled to process. Eleanor, who had asked to be present for the conversation and now stood quietly near the window, finally spoke. Her voice steady, despite the emotion still visible in her eyes, telling Silas that he owed neither of them an explanation for the choices he had made 12 years ago, but that she wanted him to understand, fully and completely, exactly what his sacrifice had actually protected. She reminded him of the night he had pulled her from collapsing rubble in a country neither of them would ever name aloud again, told him that without that single act, Ashcroft Dynamics would never have existed at all, because she would never have lived to co-found it. She told him that the company he had just saved from catastrophic betrayal was, in the most literal sense possible, a company that only existed because of him twice over, once in a war zone decades ago, and once again in a boardroom only days earlier. Silas absorbed this in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point past both women that suggested his thoughts had drifted somewhere neither of them could follow. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the calm detachment he had maintained through every other moment of the past week, cracking instead under the weight of something he had clearly never said aloud to anyone. He told them that he had simply been doing his job, that the men and women he had worked alongside during those years had done far more and received far less recognition, and that he had never considered himself deserving of gratitude for actions that had, in his own accounting, cost him nearly everything that mattered to him personally. Vivienne asked the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the very first morning, asking quietly why he had chosen to disappear entirely rather than simply retire quietly with whatever honors his service had earned him. Silas was quiet for a long moment before answering, his voice dropping lower, more honest than it had been in 12 years of careful silence, telling her that sometimes surviving a life like his was harder than sacrificing it, that coming home from that kind of darkness meant learning to carry weight that had no ceremony, no medal, no acknowledgement capable of making it lighter, and that disappearing had felt, at the time, like the only way to set that weight down at all. The room held that admission for a long moment, none of the three willing to break the silence too quickly, until Vivienne finally rose from her chair and walked to a small safe built into the wall behind her desk, one that had belonged to her mother during the company's earliest years and had been transferred, along with countless other pieces of the founding history, into Vivienne's own office when she assumed leadership. She retrieved a small wooden box from inside it, weathered at the corners, and set it gently on the desk in front of Silas, telling him that her mother had asked her to keep this safe for longer than Vivienne herself had understood the reason behind it. Eleanor stepped closer, her hand resting briefly on the lid before she nodded for Silas to open it himself, her voice thick as she confessed that she had held onto its contents for 12 years, unable to bring herself to discard them, and equally unable to imagine a circumstance under which she might actually return them to the man they belonged to. Inside the box, resting on a bed of faded velvet, lay a small metal badge etched with a single stylized constellation, the kind of insignia that existed in no public record and had been designed specifically never to be photographed or duplicated. Beside it sat a medal still sealed in its original velvet case, one that had been prepared for a posthumous ceremony that had ultimately never taken place once the government quietly decided that publicly honoring a dead operative whose existence they'd already denied created more complications than it resolved. And beneath both objects lay a single folded letter, its paper soft with age, bearing an official government seal and a short, formal message of gratitude addressed to a man the agency had listed on every surviving document as deceased. Silas stared at the contents of the box for a long time without touching any of it, his throat working silently. 12 years of carefully constructed distance, suddenly collapsing under the weight of physical proof that his sacrifice had, in fact, been seen and remembered by at least one person. Even if the rest of the world had been asked to forget, Eleanor explained quietly that she had requested these items be released to her personally in the months following his disappearance, using what remained of her own clearance and the last favors she was owed by people who had long since retired from their positions, unwilling to let the physical evidence of his service simply vanish into some records warehouse where it would never again see daylight. She told him she had kept them in that small safe for 12 years, taking them out occasionally on quiet anniversaries, to remind herself that the debt she carried was real, even if she could never repay it in any way the world would recognize. She said she had never imagined an opportunity to actually return them to the man himself, and that watching him now, sitting across from her with his hands trembling slightly over the open box, was worth more to her than any board meeting or company milestone she had celebrated in the decades since. Vivian, who had been raised on stories that always trailed off before their most important details, found herself understanding for the first time the true shape of the debt her family carried, and something in her posture shifted permanently in that quiet office, professional distance giving way to a kind of respect she rarely extended so completely to anyone. She told Silas, gently but firmly, that she had no intention of accepting his resignation, that whatever title they eventually settled on for his role within the company, she wanted him to stay. Not as a maintenance contractor working in anonymity, but as something closer to what he had always actually been, a man whose skill and instinct had already saved the company twice over, in less than a single week. She proposed, somewhat tentatively given how new this entire relationship still felt, that he consider a position advising the company's security division directly, working alongside the engineers, rather than beneath a service uniform that had never truly reflected who he was. Silas listened to the offer with the same careful stillness he brought to every decision, his eyes moving briefly to Eleanor, who nodded once in silent encouragement, and then back to Vivienne, whose expression carried none of the guarded skepticism it had held only days earlier, replaced instead by something warmer, something that made the offer feel less like a corporate proposal and more like an invitation to finally stop hiding. He did not answer immediately, needing, as he explained quietly, a little time to consider what it would actually mean to step back into a version of visibility he had spent 12 years carefully avoiding. Vivienne told him he could take whatever time he needed, and over the following week, she found herself checking in on him more frequently than the situation strictly required. Conversations that began about security protocols and gradually drifted toward quieter, more personal territory neither of them had anticipated when the week began. She learned, in fragments offered slowly and without pressure, about the wife he had lost years earlier, about the quiet apartment he kept, with almost nothing in it, about the strange, hollow peace he had built for himself in the years since his disappearance, a peace that had never quite felt like enough but had, until recently, felt like the only option available to him. Silas, in turn, found himself drawn to something in Vivienne's persistence that reminded him faintly of the version of himself that had existed before the weight of his old work wore that persistence down into caution, a sharpness of mind paired with a genuine, uncalculated warmth that made the prospect of staying visible feel, for the first time in over a decade, less like a risk and more like a possibility worth considering. 10 days after the confrontation with Bramwell, Silas returned to Ashcroft Dynamics, not in his old maintenance jacket but in a simple dark suit, standing at the front of a small private gathering assembled quietly on the top floor, away from any cameras or public announcements that might draw the kind of attention he still instinctively wished to avoid. Eleanor stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, while Vivienne addressed the small assembled group of senior staff and board members with careful, measured language, explaining only that the company had recently benefited from the extraordinary skill and integrity of a man whose full history would remain private, out of respect for both his service and the sensitive nature of the work he had once performed. She told the room, her voice steady with genuine conviction, that not every act of heroism required a public name attached to it, that some of the most important contributions to this company's survival, both decades ago and only weeks earlier, had come from people willing to work entirely without recognition, and that the company intended to honor that kind of quiet courage properly, even if the wider world never learned the details. Silas accepted the badge Eleanor had kept safe for 12 years, fastening it quietly to the inside of his jacket, rather than displaying it outwardly. A private acknowledgement rather than a public trophy, exactly the way he preferred it. He did not return to the anonymous, solitary life he had built for himself in the years before that snowy morning in the lobby. Instead, he accepted the position Vivienne had offered, stepping into a role advising the company's security division directly, training engineers in protocols that most of them would never fully understand the origins of, becoming, over the following months, something the company had never quite had before, a steady, trusted presence capable of seeing threats long before they fully materialized. He and Vivienne worked closely together in the months that followed, their professional partnership gradually deepening into something neither of them rushed to name, built slowly and carefully on the kind of trust that Silas had once believed himself incapable of extending to anyone again. Months later, as winter loosened its grip on the city, and the first uncertain hints of spring began creeping into the gray edges of Manhattan, Ashcroft Dynamics had quietly rebuilt itself into one of the most respected cybersecurity and defense consulting firms in the country, its reputation strengthened, rather than damaged by the way it had handled the crisis of Bramwell's betrayal. Transparent with regulators, careful with employees, and quietly, fiercely loyal to the people who had helped protect it. Vivienne and Silas stood together often near the same windows where Eleanor had once collapsed into tears of recognition, discussing the company's future not in terms of secrets and survival but in terms of trust, the very quality Silas had spent 12 years believing he had permanently forfeited the right to build with anyone. Eleanor, watching the two of them from a comfortable distance, felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been missing for over a decade. A sense that the debt she carried, the one she had never expected to repay, had finally, unexpectedly, come full circle. On a quiet afternoon in early spring, Silas stood alone for a moment near the same 12th floor window where he had once knelt beside an open electrical panel, invisible to almost everyone who passed him. He looked out at the city below, at the slow return of green to the parks and the easing of ice from the rivers, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, he allowed himself to simply breathe without the old, familiar weight pressing down on his chest. The name Orion no longer existed only as a ghost buried in a sealed federal file, a code word attached to a man the world had been told to forget. It had become, instead, something closer to a quiet promise, proof that a person could disappear from the world entirely and still, eventually, find his way back into a life worth living, not through grand gestures or public recognition, but through the simple, steady act of being seen, finally and completely, by people who understood exactly what that visibility had cost him, and chose to honor it anyway.